Okay. So apparently, since we lost audio for a while, quick recap. At the end of the war, people weren't happy. They were tired. The war had been far more destructive and damaging than they expected, but they were cautiously optimistic that this would never happen again and that life would be good, typified by the Kellogg-Briand Pact, where they attempt to outlaw all war for the future, thinking that people will never want a war of this scale again. Haha, World War II. We do see women gain more rights because of their involvement in World War I, namely suffrage, the right to vote, some greater economic roles, some social improvements like the ability to go out with men of their own choosing, to go drink, go smoke, go dance, you know, all the best things in life. Not really, sorry parents. We also see some nations in Europe use nationalism to put themselves back on the path to recovery, which again was problematic because nationalism was one of the causes of the war to begin with. But you're going to see this in Germany and in Italy, two countries that, well, in Germany's case, they felt they were horribly wronged by the end of the war, the Treaty of Versailles, which humiliates and cripples them. And in Italy's case, Italy just hasn't felt relevant in a while. I mean, if you think about it, they didn't get much involvement during the age of imperialism. They were actually defeated by Ethiopia, which is kind of humiliating. I mean, the last time Italy was great was when? And don't say Rome. The Renaissance. Now you can say Rome. So it's been a while for Italy, and with the heritage and the historical culture that Italy has, I mean, they're kind of feeling the pressure to do something great again. And so they will again use this national identity to rally people around and try to go, you know, rah rah Italy. Let's push forward. Let's change. Let's improve. Let's be great again. Stephen. Aren't they one of what? Oh, right. Yes, they are suffering economically along with a good chunk of Western Europe. Yes. Portugal, Italy, Greece, Spain, but there's others as well. Yeah. So yeah, it's still not quite where they would like it to be. Nick?
Now, you were saying last time Italy was great as the Renaissance. Didn't Benito Mussolini use the legacy of Rome to try and encourage support amongst the Italians?
Yes, and so I'm not saying that the Renaissance was the impetus. I'm just saying the Renaissance was the most recent time that Italy was relevant. Obviously, they were even greater during the Roman Empire. And yes, that is what Mussolini is going to hearken back to, especially because in Italy, you have so many elements of that legacy still there as physical examples, like the Colosseum, where you can point to that and say, we used to do that, let's do that again. All right, yes, sorry, Trina. Fascism, good question. Fascism is kind of like ultra-nationalism. It's nationalism taken to the nth degree, where total loyalty and obedience to the state is mandatory. It's nationalism kind of turned into a club. Fascism typically makes use of insignias or uniforms or symbols to unify everybody around a common identity or a common cause. So this goes beyond just, you know, hey, let's everybody have a flag on, you know, hanging off your house. This is, let's glorify a singular cultural identity. Oftentimes it's the military. Let's glorify our nation's military. Let's glorify military fashion. Let's wear ribbons and pins and patches and all kinds of things that show our support for our country. It tries to get people at a very visceral level, at a very strong emotional level, to connect with their country, to put their country's needs ahead of their own, to put their loyalty to their country ahead of their loyalty to their own welfare, their own economic success or failure, to take things in stride provided that it helps their country as a whole. Yes, Nick?
Now, what's the difference between fascism and Nazism?
Nazism is a kind of fascism. It's a particular brand. It's the brand that is specific to Germany. as it tries to rebuild itself after World War I. Emily? It becomes a bad thing when it blinds you to moral behavior, when it blinds you to cooperation, when it blinds you to the best interest of your people or your involvement in the international community. Because the other thing to remember is, by the time we reach the 20th century, the world is unified. Well, no, not unified. The world is connected. Right, that's a better way to phrase it. And we no longer have the option of a country existing in isolation and doing whatever it wants without there being some sort of impact on the rest of the world. Like we're seeing that now with North Korea. North Korea wants to isolate itself and do whatever it wants. The problem is they can't because the world is so interconnected. And so what one nation does now impacts others, especially in a nation like Germany, which is in the heart of Europe and surrounded by all kinds of other countries. With the interconnectivity of trade, political alliances, travel, transportation, I mean, you just can't go your own way and expect everybody else to be like, oh, that's those guys. Okay, we'll just do something different. Does that make sense? Kind of? Okay. Nationalism, to this degree, when it becomes fascism, also has a tendency to railroad people's individual rights. They become so focused on the good of the country that they become more and more willing to sacrifice individual freedoms or the freedoms of certain groups. So like what you see in Germany, where you can begin the persecution of the Jews because of this sense of national rightness. This is what's good for the country, the persecution of the Jews. Does that make more sense now? Yeah. Okay. What, Stephen? Right, right. Anybody that is deemed an enemy of the state. Right. Okay, other things you're going to see. Eastern Europe is going to be very, very different from the way that we used to know it. So if we go back to Eastern Europe before the war, these are the countries that you would expect to see. Germany, most of which is off screen, a very large United Austria-Hungary, a rather amorphous blob of Poland and Russia, all kind of combined, with a few Balkan nations down here. What we see after World War I is political boundaries that are now very, very different. You see this nationalism play out in political boundaries. We now divide Austria and Hungary. Czechoslovakia is created kind of out of the middle. Poland is now given its own independent, national borders. We're going to see for a little bit Prussia hang on as a nation. It's going to go away before too long. But also some of these, what will become Eastern Bloc nations after World War II, like Lithuania, which is where I'm from, go Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, places like that. And you're also going to see greater division within the Balkan nations as well. Temporarily, yeah. So we're going to see a little bit of that as well. Some of that, again, is related to nationalism and this desire to have your own homeland where it can just be you and your kind of people, rather than being squished together like Austria-Hungary with all different kinds of people. Yeah, Austria-Hungary had a lot of internal division, and that made it very hard to have a united war effort. And then the last thing to talk about on this slide is the rise of the U.S. as an industrial and economic superpower. We are not quite yet the military giant that we often think of ourselves as. This is not the U.S. of World War II, capable of fighting a war on two fronts and being successful. This is the U.S. that in World War I is able to make a marginal difference in the war's outcome, largely thanks to our industrial power rather than our technological superiority. But because we are untouched by the war, and because our industry is booming, and because the rest of Europe will now fall behind, now is when the United States is able to begin to emerge as an economic superpower, a military superpower, and a political superpower. It's beginning now. We have not arrived yet, and we will not really officially arrive as a global superpower until after World War II. So don't jump the gun yet. All right, questions? Okay, we're going to try to get you through the rest of the first half of the chapter real quick and talk about a couple of places that are specifically mentioned in this chapter, most notably Japan and Russia. Japan is going to undergo some of the same growth as the United States. Because again, Japan is largely untouched by the war, but their industry was booming during the war. This allows them to undergo some of the same economic growth as the United States. However, they are having some political struggles that the United States does not have. Japan has just recently recovered from European imperialism. Remember Matthew Perry, gunboat diplomacy, you're going to trade with us or bang bang. Meiji era, Japan rapidly industrializes. They're still now wrestling with this national identity. Who are we going to be? Are we going to be a traditional Asian power? Are we going to be a Western power in Asia? How is this all going to work? So they're not able to take exactly the same steps and processes as the United States, but they're going to show similar degrees of growth. Nick, you had a question / comment?
Yes. So would that mean Japan to be in between America and Italy, Germany, as in they have the economic benefits of America, but the hyper-nationalism of Italy and Germany?
Yeah, that's a pretty good comparison. Yeah. Japan has the economic benefits and growing strength of the United States, but the nationalist identities of Germany and Italy. This desire to prove their nation's greatness, to rally their people around this central notion of Japan, Japan, Japan. Japan is the focus. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we're going to see fascism, to an extent, enter into Japan as well, this hyper-nationalism. Right. And again, fascism typically plays itself out in glorification of the military, desire to militarily expand your borders in order to demonstrate the superiority of your nation. Emily? That's a really good question. The difference between nationalism and patriotism. I've never actually gotten a concrete difference between the two. My own personal take on it is patriotism seems to be a more individual phenomenon, and nationalism seems to be more of a nationwide identity. So kind of groupthink versus individual think. So like, you are patriotic, we are nationalistic. I don't even know if that's right, but that's the best I can do for you. Other questions? Cool. All right. In some of these typically more dependent areas of the world, like Mexico, other parts of Latin America, China, Iran, other parts of the Middle East, we're going to see some similar trends after World War I. Namely, how do we deal with a much weakened Europe? Prior to World War I, the response of most places in these areas to Western Europe is what?
Bow down.
Right. They are forced to, in many respects, bow down, do whatever Western Europe wants, try not to piss them off. Now that World War I is over and Western Europe is severely weakened, the door is cracked a little bit. And these nations now have the opportunity, maybe, to, and we can get poetic if you want, and spread their wings and fly. Flex their muscles, see what they're made of. I feel like this needs a background music soundtrack somehow. But for most of these places, this newfound freedom is going to express itself largely in two ways. The ability to choose and adapt their existing governments and or create new ones if they were previously controlled by Europeans, and attempt to restructure their economy and see if they can move from being a dependent economy to an independent economy. Now, when they were dependent, what did that usually mean for them? Couldn't industrialize. What else? Right, an export-based economy involving raw materials. And who did they typically have to deal with because they were export-based on raw materials? Had to deal with Western Europe. Their dream now is to see if they can free themselves from that tethered relationship with Western Europe, to see if they can become an independent economic power, to see if they can build and create and trade on their own terms, rather than being tied to a Western nation where they say, here's our raw materials, send us your stuff. Here's our raw materials, send us your stuff. Man, I hate doing this, here's our stuff. To see if they can exert more control over their economic fate. Some places will do better at this than others. Some Latin American nations will begin to experience this kind of growth and independence. We're going to see it in Brazil a little bit. We're going to see it in Argentina a little bit. We're going to see it in Mexico a little bit. You're going to see it even more so in places like Canada and Australia, those white dependencies that we talked about earlier that were given far more autonomy. It's going to be much slower to come to places like China and India that are still fighting to remove the last elements of European control. Many are still going to be stuck with this notion of being dependent. Even if they've gained their political freedom, they still won't have a better option economically than to gather raw materials and ship them off to England or France or wherever. Nick?
After the war ended, did Europe try and crack down on all the Bolsheviks starting up in their colonies?
In some cases, Europe tried to re-exert control. But one of the things they found was they just couldn't maintain the breadth of colonial interests that they had had before. Great Britain especially starts to lose control of a lot of its colonies, and at that point has to prioritize and decide what they want to keep. Right, India. In Russia, and we had talked most recently about Russia in chapter 27, about how Russia and Japan were kind of following a different path. They weren't really colonized. They couldn't quite industrially match Western Europe. And in Russia's case, they industrialized enough to stay competitive, but always near the bottom of the Western European pack. They then make a disastrous decision to get involved in World War I. They were not industrially or technologically able to compete with Germany. And within 3 years of fighting, there's somewhere in the vicinity of 2-point-something million Russian soldiers dead and a whole lot of wounded ones. And this obviously upsets the people in Russia, and they demand a change in government, and you have 2 Russian revolutions. The end product is the Tsar is removed.
He's dead.
And it's actually very similar to the French Revolution, where the Tsar is removed from power and then later executed because he's seen as a threat to the growing revolutionary movement. And then they replace him with some sort of interim government, and that interim government manages to rapidly lose control. And then that interim government is replaced by something typically far more iron-fisted. And in Russia, that will mean going from a Tsar to an attempt at some sort of representation under the leadership of Alexander Kerensky, and then finally his removal and Vladimir Lenin taking power, who will be followed by Joseph Stalin, who will create a very, very tightly controlled communist Russia. And in fact, we'll even see them change the name of their country to the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Tarina? The Bolsheviks are the political party that represents communism, that leads the revolution to overthrow the Tsar. What's ironic is that in Russian, Bolshevik means the majority, and they weren't. They were actually the minority party, but they gave themselves a name that sounded far more impressive than they actually were. And what was really funny about it is it kind of forces their political opponents, the other party, to adopt the opposite name, which is Menshevik, which means the minority, even though there was more of them. So it was just some interesting wordplay. Nick?
Wasn't the Tsar not killed until after the Bolsheviks come to power?
Come to power, but not necessarily solidified their power.
I thought he was killed while under Bolshevik custody during Russian Civil War.
Right. But in an attempt to solidify their power, they decide that the Tsar cannot continue to live as a national symbol of what Russia once was. So it's not necessarily in the heat of the revolution, but... and there's some really fun stories. This might have to be a flex kind of time. There's some really interesting stories about the Russian Revolution, why the Tsar is overthrown, who some of the other people are that are responsible. If you guys have never heard the story of Rasputin, it's well worth hearing, as well as the legend of Anastasia that is born out of the Tsar's execution. So we might have to find time for that later. What we're going to take a look at next class then, after spring break, is China. And China is going to undergo a crazy amount of change during the 20s and early 30s. And so that's what we'll touch on. So over spring break, I hope you have the opportunity to read this chapter. I hope you all have a lovely spring break. Enjoy it. I will think of you fondly while I'm on the beach in the Caymans. I probably won't think of you at all, but if I do, it will be fondly, I promise. So hope you guys enjoy, have a safe break, and we'll see you next time.